Welcome everyone to the Impact Scholar Community's third event. I'm so excited for the topic today. You know, as we were building this community, we asked the community members what topics would they like to see, and research translation was right there on the top of that list. So I'm glad that we're gathered today and we're focusing on this topic. Also, this event is kind of special in many ways. I think first is that it was always our hope that we make these gatherings hands-on, you know, and not just talking at you, so we've been able to achieve a little bit of that today. We've tried to do the speaker sessions interactive, as well as we have an experiential exercise today that hopefully will build some of your skills around translation. We also have, it's unique, this event is unique in a way because we have a great mix of folks from both research and practice. So I'll introduce them to you, or my colleague will introduce them to you in a second. Would you move, Sylvia, to the next slide, please? So before I move forward, I'm gonna want to take a moment to introduce you to our small but mighty team. So Sylvia is an assistant professor at Brock University, and this really is, this whole community is really her idea and her efforts at the beginning to bring us together. So, you know, I'm grateful for her to be so invested in this effort. Nicholas is a postdoctoral fellow at University of Michigan, and he brings such a rich experience around sustainability that it's just a pleasure to work with both of them. And I'm an assistant professor at Georgia State. I'm deeply interested in the topic of research impact, so it's just fantastic to be here with you discussing related topics. So by now, all of us are familiar with Zoom. It's an inevitable part of our lives. I'll just say a couple of quick things. You know, it'll be great if you can stay unmuted if you're not really, talking aloud in terms of a comment or question. And it is really the success of the event depends on your engagement. So type your questions and comments generously in the chat box, and we're going to save the chat and hopefully use your comments and circulate them to the community members who couldn't show up today. Also, as a caveat, just in case we experience any unfortunate incident, we will have to shut this event down, but it hasn't happened, and hopefully it won't happen at this time either. So why really research translation? You know, so I think broadly, all of us here are interested in the idea of impact, and you know, there are many pathways to research impact. You know, some commentators say that research impact is really a problem of asking the right question, and if you ask a relevant question, your research insights would be relevant too. Some say that impact is really a knowledge production problem, and co-creation is a big pathway to impact. You bring researchers and managers together so that the knowledge that you're creating together is both rigorous and relevant. Today, we're going to talk about research translation as a pathway to impact. And it seems simple on the surface, but I'm sure as our speakers will show us today, there's a lot of interesting generative complexity in research translation. And I look forward to sort of unpacking that together with all of you today. So before we hand over and welcome our keynote speaker, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the survey that we did in preparation for this event. This was in a collaboration with Network for Business Sustainability. We sent out the survey to people within our Impact Scholar community and beyond, really asking them what do they, about their research translation experience. And subsequently, we're going to share further rich details that we heard in the survey. But for now, I'm just going to point you to three quick graphs. One is the top one, where we asked, how successful do you feel you are in sort of translating your research? And as you can see, the majority said not successful at all and somewhat successful. It could very well be the nature of the demographics. We are focused on early career scholars, and in general, it's harder for early career scholars to invest time and energy in research translation. And we're hoping to change some of that today. I'll also point you to what percentage of your working time do you spend on translation. And again, There's variance around it, but in general, less than 25%. So thinking about how do you take, if you don't have too much time, how can you still accomplish some of these things that we'll talk about today? And then finally, we asked about when do you think about translating your work? And this is so important because I think if there's one thing we all take away, I'm hoping from all of this discussion, is that translation is not sort of an end of pipeline afterthought. Translation happens at every stage of your research project. And, I look forward to discussing some of that with our speakers and all of you today. What are some of those dynamics? So without any further ado, just a quick note on the agenda. Our keynote and a question and answer would last about 45 minutes. Then we'll go through an exercise of research translation. We will hear from Brian at the conversation about publishing at the conversation. And then I'm going to share a little bit about what's to come next. So I'm going to hand it over to Nicholas to introduce our speakers.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And we are especially grateful to be joined by our three distinguished speakers who are going to share their insights on connecting and translating research to various audiences. This is something that the Impact Scholar community is very interested in supporting early career researchers in doing. And the comments today are going to, we hope, be very useful for you as you build your research career and try to connect your work in meaningful ways to other groups. We're joined today by Magali Delmas, Stephanie Bertels, and Tom Ewert. And Magali is a professor at the UCLA Institute of the Environment and the Anderson School of Management. And she's the director of the UCLA Center for Corporate Environmental Performance. She works on developing effective information strategies to promote conservation behavior and the development of green markets, which is very closely tied to impacting the world of practice. And Professor Delmas also received the 2020 Distinguished Scholar Award from the Academy of Management Organizations and the Natural Environment Division. Stephanie Bertels is Associate Professor of Business and Society at the Simon Fraser University Beatty School of Management, and she's Director of the Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability. She also founded the Embedding Project that brings together leading global firms to embed sustainability across their operations. And her research examines how companies can transition to more sustainable operations and generate sustainable innovations. The Embedding Project website is a valuable resource for materials on translating research and practice. If you haven't seen that, it's worth taking a look at. It's very, very helpful. Tom Ewert is Senior Manager for Sustainability at The Cooperators, a leading Canadian multi-line insurance and financial services co-op. He works on developing and executing sustainability strategies, both within organizations and in cross-sectoral collaborations. Prior to joining the Cooperators, Tom was the founding managing director of the Network for Business Sustainability and taught business sustainability courses at the University of Western Ontario's Master of Environment and Sustainability program. He also developed the Impact program to train and enable youth leaders across Canada to become sustainability champions. Again, we're very grateful to have these three wonderful speakers today to share their insights on translating research. And we are going to have 7 minutes for each speaker. I'll keep time and I'll remind when you have 1 minute left for your comments. And after the speakers conclude, we will have a panel discussion, including a Q&A. There were some questions submitted prior to the event. We will address those as well. And audience members, please enter questions and comments into the chat box as the speakers are presenting, and we will ask those questions during the discussion also. I will now hand it over to Magali for her comments.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Hi from California here, where it's pretty early, but it's exciting. I'm happy to start my day early with you guys because I think this is super important. Now first, what are we talking about is, kind of research reaching practitioners, management, NGOs, reaching an audience beyond academia, knowledge jumping out of the ivory tower, knowledge escaping, through the windows of this tower, if it has, if it has windows. And I think we are not used to that, we haven't been used to that too much. But I think that this impact on practitioner actually is more and more valued by our universities. If you think about the revamp of the AACSB the accreditation of the business school. Now they're asking us to actually demonstrate impact on society. So I think we're going to see more requests from our deans to be, to have impact, and from our colleagues. We are also encouraged by our universities to do so. For example, at UCLA, we developed what we call the Sustainability Grand Challenge, where research faculty work together to what they call the sandpit, where we work together to develop research that will help Los Angeles transition to 100% renewable energy, 100% local water, and enhance ecosystem by 2050. It's a tall order, and it's really quite a challenge. And that's why they call it a grand challenge. For those who know Los Angeles and the difficulty we have with traffic and pollution. But what I'm saying is just, now we're encouraged to do this, which is, I think, really wonderful. On the other thing is that now there are metrics to actually measure our impact. If you think, for example, at metrics that study whether, that provides a score on whether we've been, kind of tweeted or we've been cited in newspapers. I think, this is going to change the game also when, when we are evaluated and people can kind of look at the altmetric score or any, similar score. Remember for those of you who remember before Google Scholar, citations were not that important, but now we have this number there. So, it counts. So that's for, kind of why we need to kind of think about this, kind of even more seriously, because actually it's not, I think, the way it used to be, where it was really kind of almost, kind of something that people didn't want to see you like cited in the news, or that was actually not, seen so positively, but now it is. So I think it's really encouraging. And thank you for, for organizing this event and for kind of helping the community work on that, because I think I was asked, what are the main challenges to do this? And as you kind of described a little bit in the introduction, I think the main challenge is time. It takes time to work on that. So if you think about, you work on your research design, on your literature review, you collect your data, you analyze your data, you write your paper, you go through an exhaustive revise and resubmit, process with rejections and revise and resubmit again. And then you get your proofs and you publish it. And that's when you have another entire process where you have to talk to other people, and you have to kind of translate this into a different piece for people to understand it, and then talk to journalists. And then if your research is somewhat controversial, then you have to talk to lawyers also of these companies that don't like what you're studying about them. So actually that's, I think, when you know that you are very successful. I think often the negative feedback is, oh, maybe actually that matters. But what I'm saying is that it's kind of a, if you think about this as a linear process that sees impact of translation at the end of the research journey, then you're kind of seeing this is add-on, and you might just stop before that because, like, you're just exhausted by the end of the publishing process. You, in general, don't want to see your paper anymore. And then there's this other thing that comes up. So what I'm saying is, maybe there is another way, and you mentioned that also in the introduction, is just maybe you need to think about this, kind of at the beginning of the process, so that you integrate the engagement throughout, writing and, designing your research and writing your paper. So what if you think about impact throughout the research project process, not just once the paper is done? So what are some of the strategies for overcoming these challenges? So I think the first one is, of course, talk to practitioners, right? See what world problem they want to solve, what is their kind of, their issues, their challenges, and how you can help them. So I have one example where I started to talk to one winemaker when I was at UC Santa Barbara. His name is Jim Fetzer. And he wanted to invest in biodynamic practices and was looking for some kind of eco-label that would be helpful for, kind of communicating about these sustainable practices. And he didn't like organic. He thought organic wine was really, had a bad rep. So he said, I'm going to invest in biodynamic practices. And I was like, well, what is that? And it's, he explained to me. And what we decided to do is to conduct a survey to see how much people know about what biodynamic practices are. And apparently nobody knew from our survey. And so we told him it's going to be hard to communicate about this. Most people thought that biodynamic practices, which are practices beyond organic, most people thought these were bioengineered, sci-fi, lack of understanding. So we started this research project on eco-labels, on how you kind of frame the information in a way that people can communicate and understand it, and what are some of the issues with these strategies of information strategies for sustainability. Since then, we've worked, on many additional papers with different, kind of co-authors. I work with them, and it's been really a wonderful experience where I've been all along in the process, talking to wineries, invited to wineries, invited to—
1 minute, Maggie.
Sorry, what?
1 minute left.
Okay. Well, so anyway, so what I'm saying is just, you can do this with them, and it's very rewarding. Strategy 2, talk about your research to your family and friends. Sometimes, we just talk not enough to people who are kind of beyond, the reviewers, our academic friends. It's really important, because if you can talk to your grandmother about what you do, I think then, you are more likely to reach, a broader audience. Strategy 3 is get grants. Also, when you get grants, you not only get support, but you also are able to you have to frame your research question in terms of something that matters for practice, because that's what what the grants want. Translate early while you conduct the research, engage in research, and I'm happy to talk more about this. I know I kind of went completely overboard, but in doing that, you as a researcher can offer help, and in general is data analysis. What I described with Jim Fetzer, we did a survey, we provided some data that was useful for him to make some decisions. And right now I'm working with a couple of companies where they have amazing data. A lot of the innovation in our field is coming from practice, actually. And I think it's really really exciting to be, to be able to work with them. I'm happy to talk more because I know I'm beyond, but I have actually plenty of other things I want to say.
And you've anticipated many of the questions that people submitted. So we will definitely be coming back to these points in the Q&A.
Okay.
Thank you, Maggie. And we'll now move to Steph's comments. Steph, go ahead.
Okay, so as a classic academic tactic, I'm going to start by squabbling a bit over language, and what I mean by that is, I think, to me, there's a very big difference between knowledge translation and knowledge mobilization. And what Maggie outlined as that linear process is to me that that thinking about it as knowledge translation. And whereas with all the work that I've done with all the people that are setting up this call, I think that this metaphor of translation implies that you have one group of people, practitioners, that speak a certain language, and that you have researchers that speak a certain language. And I think we really want to think of this as a space in the middle, right, where you are doing that co-creation, and as Maggie has said, if you think about that co-creation from the very beginning, then you are immersed in both of those languages, and you're working in a space that bridges them. And for me, anyways, the more I can do that, the more that I feel that I am bringing something back to both communities. So I'm taking ideas that are really grounded in practice and bringing them back and challenging some of the more theoretical ideas that we put forward. I remember having a conversation with a senior scholar. I've over the years built up, quite a bit of access to companies, and he was working on a project and he was telling me about it. And I said, oh, I know people who do that at a pretty senior level. Would you like me to introduce you to them? And his response was, I don't want to complicate my theoretical story, right? So we have to, we have to kind of realize that it's going to become messy and it's going to become complicated. So, you asked as well, and I'll just kind of throw some of these out and we can pick them up in the Q&A, but you asked about the challenges. And for me, one of the biggest challenge is you produce all this knowledge and giving it away for free, right? So it's actually really hard to give good ideas away for free, because there's a whole culture out there of kind of giving away free tools as a tactic to then lock people into consulting engagements, or to, you know, or that if it's free, it's, you know, there's so much poor quality free pseudo consulting stuff out there that people are highly suspicious of it. So that's been a piece that I think has been really challenging. Just because you put the knowledge out there doesn't mean that people are going to realize it or engage with it. And so then what's my big advice on it? It's be useful. And I know that sounds super trite, but it's something that I constantly try and keep in my head as I'm thinking about designing a project from the beginning. Will this be useful to people? Is this a useful research question? Do people actually want the answer to this? And then also, how can I be useful in engaging with them? So how can I bring value to the situation so that there is a reciprocity, that I'm not just taking data from the situation, but that I'm actually, we're together generating useful insights. And some of the ways you do that is by being a broker or convener, so that you start to accumulate smart people that you're interacting with in different industries or in different companies, and then you bring them together around a topic. And so that actually is useful to them because they get that exposure. And then the other thing that can be useful is actually just in the structuring of the data. So sometimes we think about translating our knowledge, right? But part of that knowledge is our data. So if I really super quickly share the screen, what we see is that sometimes so one of the things that we've done is we've taken the things that we come across and we've structured that information. But also, for instance, we were doing a bunch of research on goals. And so then we made that raw data available to people. And this, I think, for me has been really, how do you overcome that idea that you're providing information for free? Is people are more interested now in reading the reports that we've written or the guides that we've written, because we also have this you know, highly structured, highly transparent process of how we go about creating them. So the last two pieces of advice that I'll give quickly is to have, as you build these relationships with practitioners over time, to have those practitioners help to build space for you. So, you know, I've had a lot of success in speaking with industry associations or getting into practitioner conferences, because the companies that we've been working with have seen value in our work and are willing to put their own reputations at stake for us to give us that space. And then the last thing I would say is, and we were joking about this as we came on, is, you know, I put some time and effort into my lighting. I got a plant. You know, I have a backlight behind me, right? And so I would really, there is so much incredibly useful information right now on YouTube about how to build a micro community, how
1 minute,
to
Steph.
try and build up this idea of who you're speaking to and who your audience is and what your expertise. So I would really encourage you to spend some time, and just because that information is coming from, I don't know, a 16-year-old doesn't make it any less valuable. That's been some of the most incredibly useful information that I've found is from these very young, very brazen YouTubers. So that would be my other piece of advice.
Thank you, Steph. So there's an opportunity to start a Zoom staging consulting business where you help people understand lighting and plants as a form of expertise. Yeah.
But all that's out there, right? So, and literally I had my 13-year-old help me with it this weekend. So, but these things, these little things, the expectation, especially with everything that's gone on with the pandemic, is it's so super saturated with information that's out there. And so if you're not willing to put that effort in, people will dismiss you, right? So you actually need to kind of be willing to do that.
And we will certainly come back to strategies for cutting through all that noise that's out there and building our research as a more meaningful signal rather than contributing more to that noise. Thank you, Steph. And we'll move on to Tom now. So Tom, go ahead and take over.
Thanks very much, Nick. Let me paint a picture for you. The morning that I started to plan to work on these remarks, the following competed for my attention. Up to that point, I believe I'd had 24 different meetings, at least scheduled meetings that I was able to go back and count. I hadn't acted on a bunch of those. I had to prepare for a meeting with my boss the next working day that included 19 discussion items. So you can do the math, 60-minute meeting, 19 discussion items. You know, a team member of mine was sick, and the Trumps had just tested positive for COVID the night before, which I'd be lying if I didn't say that was pulling some of my attention away. So you're starting to get a sense of, you know, just how frenetic the day of a practitioner often looks like. At least my days often look like, with my attention spread very thinly across a broad range of subjects. Stepping back, though, from the view of one day to or 1 week to the view of a year, obviously there are some topics that require a deeper dive in terms of managers' attention and time. But what informs managers' decisions on where to allocate the scarce resource of their attention when it comes to knowledge and learning? Obviously, there are various factors that play a role, such as the ease of access of the knowledge, including the style of language used and the channel, comms channel used, topical relevance, obviously, actionability. But there's also the question of perceived value. And I think there's a perception among some that rigorous knowledge isn't always helpful in addressing challenges that are without precedent, such as climate change or global pandemics resulting in lockdowns, for example. Not all practitioners understand the value of generalizable evidence-based insights, and not all acknowledge the value of the unique perspectives and capabilities that academics have relative to theirs. So these are just a few of the challenges that came up for me as I was reflecting on this topic. So the next question becomes, what is a researcher who cares about impact to do? I have identified 4 suggestions I'd invite you to consider. They go beyond research translation, reflecting Garima and Magali's and Steph's comments just now. Here they are. First, focus where there's demand. Practitioners are not a homogeneous bunch, and nor is research. I can remember how excited I got at the Network for Business Sustainability when our efforts resulted in a really great piece of research, like Steph's research on embedding sustainability in organizational cultures. And I would think, I'd be absolutely convinced that every single sustainability practitioner in the world would be chomping at the bit. And many did, but most did not. So Steph, I think, very wisely focused on engaging deeply with those who did show interest through the embedding project and the engagement that she did even prior to that project being established. And I think that was an excellent approach to driving deep engagement and meaningful impact. Some functions, such as finance, in my view, tend to engage more actively with academics in their research. Make note of these sorts of observations and prioritize your efforts according to where you see strongest demand, which will vary from research project to research project. And then, as Steph implied earlier as well, build long-term relationships where there's good potential for mutual value creation over time. Second point, focus on your distinctive core competencies. In general, academics and practitioners have different and complementary resources and capabilities. What do you offer that practitioners typically don't have? It might be a certain knowledge or an analytical skill. It might be international contacts. It might simply be having time to reflect deeply. I'd recommend you get really clear on that and then practice pitching it everywhere you go. Learn from salespeople. Ask and listen to practitioners talking about their needs. And then look for opportunities for you to actually help them using what you do best. Your pathway to impact is going to require you developing new skills, and you'll need to invest time and effort into developing them. Third suggestion for your consideration, seek mutual value. Tell me, how does the following make you feel? I have some really valuable insights that I am here to impose on you in the hope that I create impact. Of course, you're thinking, who the heck is this guy, right? Now consider an alternate framing. From what you've told me, I understand that you face some challenges with your work. I also face challenges in mine. Perhaps we can add value to each other, right? So I want to be clear here, and I'm not just talking about reframing the situation. I'm also suggesting a two-way value proposition. For example, in the process of seeking impact, you might be exposed to new avenues of inquiry or gain access to new unique data sets that can further your academic career. I know it's easier said than done, but why not seek the holy grail of both more impact and better research simultaneously? Final point, timing is everything. And I mean this on multiple levels. For example, I might receive the greatest, most relevant research insight in my inbox at a time when I'm completely bogged down putting out fires, and I might never see it. Or I might have identified the perfect collaborative project to undertake in partnership with academics, but if our time availabilities or work timeframes don't coincide, it may never be pursued. And of course, this applies on both sides, as Magali said up front. If you want impact, in my opinion,
1 minute, Tom.
you may need to be prepared to reprioritize when opportunities arrive. One academic that I know very well, who actually straddles the world of practice as well, has become the first person on big media's call list for any comment related to climate adaptation in Canada, partly because he's committed himself to answering every single one of media's calls and immediately making himself available to them on whatever their timelines, and often they're unreasonable. And let me tell you, he has impact. So to close, thanks for your time and attention, and also thank you for your courage in seeking impact. I know the academic incentive schemes are stacked against you. Maybe that's changing, as Magali implied up front. But until that changes fully, I know you cannot lose focus on the need to publish if you want to stay on the tenure track. But having said that, at a time when we face such seemingly intractable societal and organizational issues, and at a time when the pendulum seems to be swinging away from rationality towards post-truth, your work is more needed than ever. So I'll look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Tom. And I think the comments about timing are really important for early career researchers to think about, because you get socialized into the timelines of academia that are very slow compared to practice, and start to really lose the ability to even understand what other timelines look like. I'm sure this will come up in our Q&A session. So Sylvia, let's move over to the Q&A, and we're going to begin with some questions that were submitted prior to the event, and then we've also got some great questions coming in through the chat box. So please continue to add your questions and comments there.
Yes, thank you, Nicholas, and thank you to our three keynote speakers. I think you really touched on most of the points that we heard in advance when it came to that topic. And I will just start with a few questions, and then we move on to the chat. And one question that seems to come up very often is the issue of time. So Tom, you mentioned it, different timelines. Magali, you mentioned it as well as Stephanie. And since we're all early career scholars, this seems to be a very huge problem, because we have to consider getting our publications. We are very new into teaching when we come from the PhD program, so we need to learn our teaching skills. And at the same time, we're also interested in contributing valuable research, right, and reaching out to a wider audience. So what are your advices for early career scholars how to manage the time? And let me start with Stephanie here, because Stephanie, you are kind of the youngest in the room in terms of the keynote speakers, and you started very early on with the embedded project to engage with impact work. So how did you manage it, the time when you were an early career scholar?
Yeah, and so I would say I started right from the beginning, I think Maya has just put a link to the article where Tom and I are co-authors with others, and I address this quite pointedly in that article. That I think I'll be honest with you, I think it's a leap of faith, right? And so you have to think of you have to have enough confidence that this is the career for you and this is the career that you want to build. And to think about it as a foundation at a very early stage. So from my perspective, I wanted to ground my research and practice because I saw it as a pipeline, right? So one of the challenges that we face as researchers often is access. And I have no limitations on access at this point, right? In fact, what I've been able to do is facilitate access for a whole group of other researchers, my PhD students, my collaborators, and others, because I was able to build this. And I just had the faith that if I did that would be the case. And so it's meant that you know, some of the research that I've produced is in very novel settings, or I have an unusual level of access, and so that's helped me in publishing later on. But at the same time, you have to, like anything else, you have to commit to it, right? So I was really kind of hustling in the sense that I had to make sure that I was getting my existing papers out. And so that was the thing, is that you can't do one at the expense of the other. So while you're building that rapport and relationship with practice, and really, as Tom said at the very early stages, really concertedly learning from them, right? Not trying to teach them anything. But at the same time, those first couple of papers, you have to just put your head down and get them out.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Stephanie. And that's something we kind of keep hearing also during the other events, that you kind of should not sacrifice one over the other one. It should go together. Let me move on to Magali. Magali, how do we get as junior career scholars, how do we get the time that we put in translating our research? How do we get it valued from the universities or the institutions we are at? That's a question that came up in our survey as well.
So as I mentioned before, I think that now we are on a different path than when I started. I think it's encouraged. It doesn't mean that it is, you know, kind of doesn't have some downside, that there are no trade-offs, because there are trade-offs, right? But I think we're really on a different trajectory now. Now, you know, we do have resources in some, you know, in like the conversation. When I started, this didn't exist, right? So we have resources of, you know, kind of potential outlets for our research, you know, for the translation that didn't exist. We have, I think, in some universities, some now translators, communicators who are actually asking for that, you know, kind of information. So I think it's a little easier, and I would kind of, I think we're on a right trajectory. I agree with, you know, all of you that it's kind of an investment for the long term. So when you start to communicate and talk to a practitioner, it doesn't always immediately kind of pay off. So this time that you're spending now is in general kind of sometimes paying in a couple of years in terms of establishing the relationship. So it is an investment for the longer term. And that's true that you might think about it as something that, you know, should kind of put off for the future. But I strongly encourage you not to do that. And I think Stephanie is the perfect example of someone who has actually kind of, you know, invested early. And I wish I had done the same, honestly. So, but you know, it was, I think, way more difficult at the time, maybe than now, I would say. I think, you know, there are also issues of controversy. And I've seen some in the chat, some of the comments, and sometimes, you know, you want to early in your career to shy away from some of this controversy, because that might be you know, problematic for your career. And that's true, that there are sometimes, you know, a little bit of some dangers. So you have to be careful also. Sometimes your results, so it happened to me that sometimes some of my results were felt, you know, I developed an air pollution app, and one of the companies that was polluting, you know, kind of sent their lawyers to kind of tell me, well, you know, we don't like your app because it's, you know, portrays us in a kind of negative light. So this is the type of thing that you could face, and then you have to kind of, be prepared for that. So it's not all rosy. What I'm saying is that shows that what you're doing is touching a nerve. And I think in academia we have, and we're here for entering a discussion that matters to kind of the society in general. And I think it's really more fun to do this, even though sometimes, you have to fight a little bit. So, but I think we should not shy away from it, even earlier on.
Thank you, Maggie. Those were kind of really great words, and that's why we are here as a community, right? To kind of also support each other and to share our thoughts and also our probably failures that we had along the way. So thank you very much. In the interest of discussions around time, I would also like to ask Tom a question, because Tom, you started with how busy your day is normally and how difficult it is to get hold of you. And something that we received very often was the question about what is the best way of engaging with practitioners, and what are maybe things that don't do well and you can tell us here right now, please stop doing it, it doesn't work. So what are your advices?
Yeah, it's a great question. Coming back to time, but just interpreting the word in a slightly different way. It all depends on what is going on in the moment, in the day, and assuming that if your research goes out in a newsletter or an email or whatever it is, a tweet, assuming that means that that it's out there and it will be consumed, and that's all the effort that's required. That I think is a faulty assumption, and it's more about connecting the insight or the opportunities or just the desire to have a conversation with the practitioners, not just in the right way, but at the right time. And so I think I guess the point I'm trying to make is it's about a dialogue. It's about an ongoing dialogue, which often requires a base of relationship in order to work, as opposed to a transaction of an exchange of information, as in a transaction. So don't think of research, translation, and communication activities as once and done. Think of them as ongoing dialogue and relationship building.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tom. In the interest of having enough time for the workshop that we're having with Maya, let's move on to the chat. And one of the main questions that came up, Nicolas, what did you identify?
Sure. So I think as we are about to move into the workshop, a key component of which is identifying the audience that you're trying to speak to. I would like to ask the speakers a question from Katarina. She directed the question at Maggie, so maybe Maggie can go first in answering, but I think that everyone has something to contribute to this. And Katarina writes, I was wondering, for some big topics like climate change, a variety of different stakeholders are involved, and they each typically describe the problem differently. So how, as a researcher, do you identify and frame the problem?
That's a good question and a tough one. Thank you for posing it. Yes, I mean, we are in a conversation with the multiple audiences, right? So I think, you have to have a primary audience that you're targeting, but you need to engage in the conversation. So that's, they might have different views on, how you measure things and what you think of you're using your scientific approach to kind of enter that discussion. So I'm not sure this is really kind of a problem to have so many different audiences, having different perspectives. You're using your, kind of scientific data-based approach and to kind of enter that discussion. So then, eventually you might be perceived as we discussed a little bit before, as having, being in one camp at one point. But as long as what you're doing is based on your research and is documented and you're kind of clear on your methodology, I think you just need to kind of put it out there, and that's your piece. And it's really important because, as we know, in these controversies, in these discussions, there's such a lack of, kind of science-based kind of information. So I think that's in some ways, we really need to be able to enter that discussion, and we really need to provide our vision, our view. And, people might disagree. Well, that's the way it is.
Thank you. Tom, do you have some comments on this question?
Yeah, I might approach answering the question in a slightly different way. I see this as one of the early steps in the knowledge mobilization process that Steph just described earlier. And I don't think, I mean, the good news is that don't worry, you don't need to do it alone. You should not do it alone in terms of framing the research question. This should come out, I think, at least with the most complex problems, research problems requiring collaboration. This should come out through dialogue, where you're listening deeply to the points of view and the underlying rationale for different positions, and you're figuring out exactly how to scope the research question such that it will address the problems and result in something meaningful for everyone involved. I think research questions often, at least in the world of practice, are defined too quickly, too hastily. You need to invest a significant amount of time up front in order to ensure that you're answering the right question, and that you're answering it in the right way to result in to yield the results that you need. In the case of practice, something actionable and often something commercializable, for example. But that requires investment up front. So in the context of research mobilization, holistically, I think this is one of the earlier conversations to have researcher and practitioners together.
Thank you, Tom. And Steph, would you like to add?
Yeah, just quickly, sorry, to build on that, I think to me, it is all about relationships. And so I remember years ago going to an academy session, and Percy Huggins was talking about, you have these papers, you need to take them out of the drawers and get them off their computers and give them a social life. And what he was talking about is, even to do sort of, even just to get your paper published in a journal, you need to engage with that micro community. You need to build that community of people that you can discuss your ideas with. And I think this is the same. You need to build a set of micro communities. So if I was thinking about how I would address this issue, I have over time built those relationships with people who are parts of those different communities. And so, number one, I'm pretty regularly engaging with them, so I have a sense of where the conversation is going, right? But number two, if I'm feeling that I'm out of touch with the conversation, I have a way to get back into it. So I just think build that and continue to nurture those relationships over time.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone, for your.
Can I just say something?
Yeah, no, go for it.
So you ask us about, kind of the resource and the difficulty to be starting as a, junior. And I just want to give you just one example of something that happened to me recently in terms of how I'm perceived by the community. So I published a book, called The Green Bundle. And I realized that for a lot of the practitioners before publishing this, I was a different person. So there's something also on how they identify you, and the fact that our journals and the way it just as not perceived as something they can even, understand and comprehend. But suddenly for a lot of people, I became an author, which before, the papers I published did not exist. And then suddenly they are interested in talking to me because there is this piece. Maybe it's because it's physical, maybe, I'm not sure what it is, because the content is not very different from what I published in, in academic journals. But this is suddenly you exist as a kind of someone they can talk to and feel comfortable talking to, because you made that effort. I'm not saying that you should do that immediately when you're an assistant professor, but think about it actually earlier than later. Because if you want to have impact on practice, this is something that will really help you a lot. That's just one, you know, from my recent experience.
Thank you. Something that I kind of keep hearing from all of you is there's kind of no one fits it all template or solution you can follow in order to translate your work, right? It's kind of really, you need to find your own voice that fits with your own personality, identity, with your research, and kind of the way you engage with others. And that's actually a very good transition to Maya now in her workshop, because she will actually help us to find our own voice in our research and how we can translate them to practitioners. Garima, would you like to introduce Maya, please?
I would love to introduce Maya, and thank you for that amazing discussion. So Maya is my dear friend and colleague. Whatever little I know about research translation, I know because of her, from her. She's the knowledge manager at the Network for Business Sustainability. She got her PhD from University of Michigan, so she's a great example of straddling research practice worlds. And she took the time to package all of her experience into the guide that she's going to take us through today. So Maya, up to you.
Okay, super. So this feels like a really wonderful event, and it feels like a very friendly event. You know, I think a number of the folks who are speaking I've worked with in the past. So as we shift into the exercise, what I want to say is that I hope it feels like a friendly event for everybody who's participating. You know, I think the Impact Scholar community is exciting because it's here really as a set of supportive folks to help everybody navigate these kind of shared concerns and shared issues. So we'll try to make this interactive. There are a lot of folks on the call, so it won't be kind of as direct a conversation as we might like, but we encourage you to put things in the chat as we go along, and there will definitely be at least a few opportunities for folks to unmute themselves and have a bit of a conversation. And I have invited / coerced Brian Keogh, who is a business editor at The Conversation, to join in providing some feedback. So he is a great voice. NBS is an online website that provides sort of practitioner-oriented knowledge on a range of sustainability issues, and The Conversation, as you'll hear in more detail later, is well, maybe when Brian comes on, I'll let him say something about it that's more accurate than what I would. But in short, I hope that between the two of us, you'll get kind of a good different perspective on how to shape content for a practitioner audience. So I am going to share my screen here. And you should all have received via email a guide that looks kind of like this. And maybe I can ask Sylvia if she could, or one of the leaders, if they could copy it into the chat. I just tried to do that, but I'm not very technologically adept. So in case you don't have easy access to it, this is our little guide, and you can kind of walk through it as we go through the slides and even fill it out. So we hope that by the end of this, you will have some content that takes you closer to that place of transition, or the research translation, sorry. All right, I'm just fighting with my windows here, but I think everything's tidy, so I will share the screen. And one thing that actually surprised me when I started working for NBS was how designed everything was. So kind of building on what Stephanie says or said, you know, we don't just put out Word documents, we have pictures and colors and fonts. So I think it does speak to that notion that that presentation matters, maybe more than we learned in grad school. All righty, let's see. What we're going to do here, this is sort of how the guide is structured and how the presentation is structured. So we'll work through a few different spots. The first one is identifying the audience. The items that are in orange here are all kind of iterations of the same thing. So, you know, you need to know where your content is going, but you also really want to kind of work on and refine that content. So the orange blocks are where we'll do a bit of that. Starting with just kind of a headline and a core message, and then moving on to a pitch, and then eventually the full content, which will not happen in half an hour, but we can at least give some imagery and ideas. Okay, these are my caveats. As Garima can testify, I tend to be a bit of a pessimist, so like to start with some qualifications. The first one, as everybody pretty much on this webinar has said, and as the people who answered the survey that the organizers circulated often also said, co-creation is really where you want to place your efforts for maximum impact. And so that's about developing your research in interaction with practitioners rather than just sharing it, say, at the end. And Garima has led this web link is to some wonderful resources that Garima has developed for NBS that feature sort of insights and guidance from a lot of folks who care a lot about co-creation. And the second caveat is that in an ideal world, this would probably not be your job. I mean, I will tell you honestly that when I am writing for NBS, what is most helpful to me is not having done a PhD, but rather having had the celebrity beat at my college newspaper. So, you know, so having written about Dr. Ruth Westheimer and Michael Douglas is better preparation for trying to communicate with a sort of more general audience. However, this is sort of where we are, and research translation, you know, I think co-creation can be, it's time intensive, but can be really satisfying, and translation can also be satisfying, you know, talking to journalists, things like that. So there's value here in many ways. All right, so if you look at the guide on page 2, we have who's your audience? What groups or individuals would you like to see apply your research? And I'm going to show one of the slides from the survey. So this is sort of what we heard from the, I believe, 50 or so people who answered the survey. Think about this. Feel free to write down one or more audiences in your guide. And also, as you do that, I would encourage folks to type ideas into the chat as a way for us to kind of learn from each other. When Garima and I were talking about this presentation, one of the things we talked about was sort of the value of having a specific audience. And I think that's come up before, you know, that if there are leaders in a particular industry or alienated government workers, you know, whoever you're really thinking about as you craft your ideas. And I'm actually going to pause here and ask Brian if he'd like to unmute himself and say something perhaps about the conversation and how you think about your audience that you're trying to reach.
Sure. Hello, everybody, and sorry I'm a little late to the conversation or to the discussion. Yeah, so the conversation we've been around since 2011. In the US, we've been around since 2014. And basically, we try to bridge this divide between scholarship and academia and the general public, and bring the rigor, the research, the evidence, the expertise of all of you to just normal people going about their daily lives and get it into the public domain. And so, in a sense, in talking about what Mayo was saying about audiences, about what group are you speaking to, we're trying to speak to everyone in a sense, not left, not right, not educated or not educated, or particularly even country. Even though I guess our audience is mostly in the U.S., at least for the U.S. conversation, but it really is a global audience, and we're really trying to craft articles that could engage anybody. Really anybody who would find this the content, the ideas and the research, or whatever else makes up the article, anybody would find it interesting could engage with it, right? So we're writing. I mean, really, the articles look like, it should look like, you might find in a quality newspaper or a quality news site. It's that the writing has to be that solid, but yet the scholarship and the research are really at its core. So they're not op-eds and that kind of thing. They're explanatory and research driven and evidence driven. So yeah, I mean, our audience, it's just the general public. And so, I mean, the stuff that I'll talk about later is maybe just, I think, applicable to any audience really, outside of like, your special little technical audience, your peers. We're trying to get the stuff beyond the silo that you sit in. And so, yes. So I take a very broad approach to audience, in that, policymakers do read our stuff. Congress, people in Congress, cite our articles on the floor of, the Senate or the House, but they're not the intended recipient. Is there anything else you wanted me to say about that, or does that help? That good?
Nope, I think that's perfect. And one of the things that stuck in my head actually at a presentation that Brian gave was you're saying that when you write, you often think of your sister. So that's, or that when you edit, so that she could be an audience for.
Exactly, and that's one I frequently tell scholars when they're writing, and if they're having trouble writing in a colloquial way, conveying the rigor of the research. I mean, we don't want to lose the depth and the accuracy, but we want to make it understandable. And so it helps to imagine a specific person, a niece, a nephew, your teenage child, your parent, anybody, anybody you can think who's like far outside of, you had conversations with this person before about the stuff you do, so how is work going, so-and-so, and they ask you about it, and you don't launch into a very technical, jargony explanation. You say what you think will interest them, right? Yeah. And you don't dumb it down. You simplify. There's
right.
different ideas. So.
Okay, that's great. Yep. And I've just been reminded that we're sort of on a little bit of a timeline. So what Brian has said is vital for the next section, which is about your message. So this is on page 3, and what he has said is what I often say as don't use jargon, but it also encapsulates kind of other themes as you're trying to effectively communicate. And we go into those in a bit more detail on page 3. It's things like kind of emphasizing the relevance. It's pulling out a few keywords that are particularly powerful. So here, take the article that you're thinking about, that you've recently completed, that you think is important, and try to encapsulate it in a headline and maybe a short paragraph. The story that I like to tell here is that when I joined NBS, I tried to think of headlines that were kind of funky and clever, like "It's not easy being green." And our webmaster sort of told me this is not helpful, because if you're writing for the web, folks are going to find it by typing in questions, and nobody's typing in, is it easy being green? Instead, they're typing in, how can I build business resilience? How can I motivate my employees? Why is my boss such a jerk? Whatever. So if you have answers to those questions, you're more likely to have people find your content. Yep, and Stephanie just said the same thing. So now I know I'm right. All right. So try to write up something like that, and again, I would encourage folks to share in the chat. We can try to provide some real-time feedback, and you can see how other people are thinking about these issues. So I'll pause for a few moments and just encourage people to try to do that. I think I also used to be very fond of titles that had colons, partly as a way to sneak in my funny ideas. But what I've learned is that having just 2 or 3 keywords is actually more powerful. Is there somebody who'd like to volunteer to share a title, and maybe even a paragraph? Okay, great. How do you, is it Ieva? Nicholas, can folks unmute themselves, or do we need to do that?
They should be able to. I just unmuted.
Okay, awesome. If it's easier to share in the chat, feel free to do that rather than.
I think she muted herself back.
Okay.
Oh, internet, sorry.
So Brian and I are the least scary people you will encounter. We are, if anything, I am, if anything, intimidated by all of you and your brilliance. So really encourage you just to make use of us.
So Maya, you want an example? I could provide one.
That sounds wonderful. Please do.
So we've done some research on activist hedge funds, and we find they're more likely to target companies if they have good CSR performance. So it was something like why activist hedge funds target companies that are good in sustainability or something along these lines.
Okay, do you want to, I'm sorry, so say the headline one more time.
Why activist hedge funds target based on corporate sustainability. Or
okay.
Yeah, something along these lines.
Brian, do you want to give a perspective on this?
You said why activist hedge funds target corporate.
Why activist hedge funds target socially responsible firms?
So I mean, that kind of sounds like it says this part of the story, but it also does it connect with a reader who doesn't know what an activist hedge fund is. You know, they don't like that word activist hedge fund. You know, that's going to be obvious to anybody who works on Wall Street, but it's not going to really mean a lot to my parents who live in North Dakota. You know, they're not going to. They don't know what an activist hedge fund is really, or it doesn't like click in their heads as being, oh, you know, this is what they do. And so you probably want to tweak that. You know, you don't even have to say activists. Why hedge funds? You know, hedge funds, you know, as a group can do this. You know, maybe they happen to be activists by doing that or whatever. But then target socially responsible firms. You know, I think you can drill it down more. Like, what are they trying to do? Why hedge funds? Target also doesn't tell you what they're trying. Is it negative or positive? Are they trying to? Are they short selling these companies, or are they interested in these companies and they buy their shares and they go up? Right? You know, why do they want? Why are hedge funds? You know, like I would try to get at what it is that, what does it mean? Why does it matter? Like, how hedge funds are, you know, destroying socially responsible companies, if that's what you mean, if that's what they're doing, if they're pulling these companies down, right? You know, that's why it matters, that they're hurting these firms, that they're hurting these companies. You know, they're making it harder for them to grow and you know, get financing, right? But if they're doing a positive thing, like how hedge funds, you know, secretive hedge funds or whatever, you know, kind of language you might want to describe them, are betting big on, you know, sustainable companies and, you know, making the world a greener place. You know, like you just kind of try to convey why it's significant within the headline. You know.
Yeah.
So,
and Brian, may I interrupt you? Because I think we have, Grima and Nicholas told me we have like 10 more minutes? I'm negotiating here.
So I planned until 11:45. It depends
Okay.
on sort of the time that Brian needs, but since he's introduced himself already, maybe let's go until 11:48.
Okay, fair. All right. So what I would add to what Brian says is first of all that it's brilliant. I actually wrote an article on your paper, I think, and the title that I used was "Why Activist Hedge Funds or How Activist Hedge Funds Are Bad for Sustainability." So as I listened to Brian, I'm like, whew, that was sort of loosely on track with at least some of his suggestions. I think also because NBS has a business audience, I was less concerned about using the phrase activist hedge funds because I figured people, would have more familiarity with it. Let's shift over to Yeva's title, which is the ABCs of Social Entrepreneurship in Chile. And I will give my 2 cents, which is, I like social entrepreneurship. I like Chile. That, it seems very concrete. ABC seems like a nice approach to it. We've found an embarrassing level of success with articles that have lists embedded in them, so for whatever, or numbers, so for whatever reason, we seem to be drawn to, 3 ways to do this, 4 steps to X. So ABC evokes that for me. Brian, what are your thoughts?
I mean, so that could be a headline for a more technical audience, I think. It doesn't really tell me what's the story, what are we saying about it? Like, what is it, what's interesting about it, what's engaging about it? I don't mean to be harsh or anything about any of these headlines. I'm giving you my, because I think like the word activist, I might go with it, I might not, I'm just kind of, I might avoid it because it doesn't add a lot to the general audience, but it's a negotiation and it doesn't necessarily detract from it. It might be a buzzword that can help. It might be a word that's SEO, in search terms and everything. I would just try to get at like what's changing? Like how is that audience, how are you going to convince somebody in the US or somebody in the UK or somebody in Australia or somebody in Europe to click on that article? Like what about social entrepreneurship in Chile is different or interesting, unique? Are they doing it in a different way that can show US entrepreneurs how to do it better? I would try to think in terms of that. Like on the jargon topic, I mean, like we often think of jargon as these words that are technical and hard to understand, but jargon is beyond that. Sometimes jargon is how an industry, a field uses a term that's very common, but in a specific way that's different from how we use it colloquially, right? And so it could be, the most common word in the world, but it just, when you read it in that context, it's totally different from what we're used to seeing. And so it's very jarring to readers. So and the ABCs of social response entrepreneurship in Chile can work. I mean, lists, I was very right. I mean, people love lists. Lists are a good way to organize and different things. But I just might think of it differently. You just need to give readers a reason to click on it. Doesn't mean like overselling it or super sensationalizing it, but just, what's kind of in it for me, whether it's personal or whether it's just like broader like interest. Why would I care? How social entrepreneurship is done in Chile. Just try to include that idea in the way you frame the story, both for the headline, but also like when you're spelling out what the story is about. In the first 3 or 4 paragraphs, this is what my story is. This is why it's interesting. This is why it matters. This is why it's worth your time. Right? Because you are trying to, people are busy, you're trying to, in your field, people will read it because they're really interested in the topic, right? You already got them, with Chile and social entrepreneurship, they already want to know. But if you're trying to convince somebody who doesn't already have an inherent interest in the topic, you need to sell it a little bit, right? You need to show them, Show them a
Okay.
little leg, I guess.
Show them a little leg. That's perfect. Okay, so we've given you a little fantastic feedback from Brian, and we've given you a little bit of a hard time. The next two slides hopefully will make you feel a little bit more supported. So these are about outlets and resources for contacting your preferred audience or your desired audience. And the guide has some additional suggestions on pages 4 and 5. I think what's exciting to me here is just that there are.
Can I jump in for
Yeah.
just 1 second?
Totally.
There's something Amelia put in the chat, and I think
Yeah.
this is something that I experienced and I remember like you and Tom pushed me on this at a very early stage. It's this overcoming. As academics, we're taught language is so precise and you can't use vague terms and it has to be exactly what you're talking about. And what Brian is advising us to do is completely different to that. And it's mind-blowing at first. And so I just want to say that is the hump. And kind of the concern is you put it out there and people will misconstrue you or they'll misquote you or they'll not understand. And that is the big hump. And you just have to play around with it a little bit and you start to get more comfortable.
Yeah. Sometimes I think, by the end of grad school, I feel like I've built up like defensive fortifications, and in some ways connecting with users can be an opportunity for more fun, for more creativity, for more engagement. You don't have to wear, maybe you do have to wear a suit. I don't know, but it's, I think having some of that kind of fun and flexibility. And so I typed show a little leg in the chat because I think that's a wonderful philosophy.
Maya, I would add on to that one way to do this, to get over that hump, is to create an anonymous account on Reddit and just go out and try to write about research and in the various communities on Reddit that are interested in your area of work and see how people respond. Because you will find that no matter how you write it, people are going to interpret it in ways that you don't understand how it's possible to interpret it. And becoming comfortable with that, I think, is useful too.
Yeah, I think that's great. So the reason why I think this is an upbeat slide is because people do care. People are interested. You do have something to say, and maybe it's appropriate for a big audience. Maybe it's appropriate for a small audience. But but again, there could be a consulting business of matchmaking. But I think you can definitely find somebody who wants to know. And the next slide is about resources. So if we had more time, I would encourage you all to write down what outlets might reach your audience and also to share that in the chat. I think for now, we'll just keep going. But and this slide is not particularly interactive, but it's again just kind of an encouragement. Like your university probably employs people who were previously journalists and can kind of share that expertise with you. We've just hired 2 student interns who are making videos for us, who are, sorry, I think they'll next be, I'm sure coming up with memes related to research. I can't wait to see what they do. So I think there are kind of ways that you can leverage at least a little bit of support for the work you're trying to do.
Maya, we have to wrap up in about a minute.
Okay, so the last thing that we would love to do with you is to help you develop a pitch. And in some ways, this is just kind of integrating the different topics that we've covered. Something that Brian and actually Kurt Nickisch at Harvard Business Review said that really resonated with me is that when you're writing to somebody, you want to find a specific individual. You don't want to just kind of message an inbox. You want to do a little internet stalking, which, is I think a skill of the 21st century. The subject, you want to repurpose a little bit of the oomph from the headline you came up with, and then the body, the topic, why it matters, sort of application, relevance. There's a lot of sort of sources on the internet about how to make a pitch, you know, and as Steph said, just because these might come from 16-year-olds, actually probably more like 24-year-olds, you know, that doesn't mean that they aren't helpful. And one of the things that resonated with me is that they all kind of emphasize that you need to show that you have the evidence, that you have the chops to kind of pull this off and articulate it. And you do, you know, you've done your research, you have your data. So that's another way that you're well positioned to make these pitches. Write the content. So see your guide, and there's a lot more material there. And then, as Jerry Maguire would say, help us help you. So I just want to close with these two pictures, which represent online interfaces for NBS and for the conversation. These are places where you can share your ideas and maybe carry these conversations a little farther. And also, you know, just another shout out for this community. I had the privilege of looking at some of the survey responses, and people have such good ideas and such good experience. So Garima and I are going to try to write all of that up and share it with you as well.
Well, thank you so much, Maya. Thank you for all your hard work in creating this guide. And I think we could have organized the whole session around just going through the guide. So I just want to acknowledge the hours and days and weeks that you put into it. And I hope we can share it widely. And I hope everyone on the call does too. I'm going to hand it over to Sylvia, who's going to introduce Brian.
Yes, thank you very much, Garima. Also, thank you very much, Maya. I can just echo Garima's kudos to you and all the work you have put in developing that guide. So we already heard about Brian along the workshop, but let me just quickly introduce Brian officially. So Brian is the senior editor for Economy and Business at The Conversation. He's an extensive experience in editing actually a variety of topics. It's around business, finance, and economics, and he worked at several journals. Among others, he worked for Bloomberg News in London and New York, and he worked for the Bold magazine in Beirut. And today, Brian will share a few insights about how to publish at The Conversation, which is a not-for-profit media outlet that publishes news stories written by academics and researchers. So welcome, Brian. We are looking very much forward to your insights from the conversation. Just for your orientation, you have around 5 to 7 minutes before we wrap up the event.
Okay, thanks, Sylvia, for the kind introduction, and I'll try to be very, very quick. So I'll start by actually jumping off of what Maya said about pitching. And so she had a great, what she said at the end about pitching, find a specific person to pitch to, be very direct and really direct about what your topic's about, what you're trying to convey and what the research is, et cetera. But that being said, we actually at The Conversation, we encourage people to pitch through a forum only because it's easier to track. And so, and make sure that your pitches actually find the right editor that you want the right desk, if it's politics or environment or business, but also make sure it's tracked. So if you pitch me and I'm on holiday, maybe I'll miss it. Maybe when I'm coming back and I have this, avalanche of emails, I don't see yours. And so then you're wondering, like, what happened? Like, didn't they like my idea? When in fact it was just, it just gets lost in the email inbox. While if you go through the system, and I'll just send you the links I just put in the chat, and you can just go straight there. It's also on the home page. If you go down on the home page on the bottom right, it just says, tell us your idea. And you can just pitch, and it kind of prompts you with basically the same things that Maya was saying in terms of like, what's the story about? Why is it significant? Why does it matter? Here are the research that goes into it. So as far as the conversation goes, and we talked about the audience a little bit, I mean, we are writing for this, the general audience. I mean, broadly speaking, I mean, it's just anybody who might find your research enlightening, helpful, useful in understanding the events of the day, the news of the day, what's going on, topics of big interest. It doesn't have to be in the news to be really interesting. Inequality is always, or sustainability, climate change is a massive global problem that we're not really taking that seriously in the US, and at least the government level. And it matters. I mean, our lives are at stake in this case. And so finding ways to connect your research and help readers better understand the topic or what's changing, what's new, trying to find concrete ways or use your research to show concrete ways or interesting ways or evidence-based ways that you can move the needle. You can help readers see in a different way, or show them there is progress. Maybe there is hope in some areas, things that are going on. Like after 2017 election, the government's stepped back, of course, in Paris and everything else, but companies were stepping up along with cities and states, in certain parts of the country to do more. They were doing things that they hadn't done before. And so there are positive stories you can tell, and bringing those stories to readers and helping them see, where we're making progress, and that it's not hopeless, just all hopeless, that we're all gonna die in about 20 years, 30 years, is a great, useful thing. And so, like, again, about our stories, it's really bringing together scholarship evidence. We want substance, we want depth, but then writing in a way that, you'd find in a quality newspaper, in an engaging way, an accessible way, in a journalism kind of format, so it's intro, you gauge readers with intro, either something that illustration of the news, or just something that's, helps readers see what they immediately, why this is worth their time, why they should be interested in what you have to say. And then it pivots right to your research. This is my research shows X. As an expert in sustainability, I believe Y, and it just really, you get to the point quickly, and that kind of thing. What we do, we're not op-eds, so we hear that a lot. I want to pitch you an op-ed, this and that, but we're different. We don't want opinion. This is about research evidence. So one of the most valuable things that you can do for readers is actually explain things. So something, if your field, your topic's in the news, like you see a newspaper report, New York Times, and of course they put it all, they destroy the story, they misrepresent what the research really is, and whatever they do. Reporters like me, we're not very bright, and so we might get it wrong. And so this is the opportunity to explain it right, to help readers understand what's really at stake, what are the key takeaways of something, answer questions. It doesn't even have to take very long. You're doing research, it's really important to you and everything. You've been spending 10 years on it. If something's in the news that you're an expert on, you can just write that. Just explain something for readers. There's a jargony word suddenly in the news. Social distancing is something that's been around for a long time, I think. But I don't think most of it had heard the term until March. And so an article that just simply explains what it means back in March would have been very useful. Like what is viral load, and just explaining is probably one of the most important things we do for readers, and it's public service, really. We're also looking for
one more minute to wrap up, because we have a few announcements at the end of the event.
So there are a lot of, so basically if you have an idea, some research, something that's interesting in the news, or you think it's just something that connects to an important topic, whatever it might be, it just, pitch the idea, try to convey why it matters, why it's important. We have special sections devoted to, or special formats devoted to new research called the Research Brief, which is all about new research. And it doesn't have to be groundbreaking, but it's meant to help scholars write articles about the new research without the need for a narrative, without the normal journalistic practices, so just right to the point. My finding is this, you really show readers what's at stake, what's interesting about it, right to the point, then explain it, unpack it, why it matters, etc. We have features like Curious Kids, which is interesting little research thing about, something that kids would be curious about, just something interesting in the world. And we have other things like that, other special formats, try to provide insights. In thinking about a pitch, try to make sure, it'll appeal to a general audience. It won't just appeal to managers, but if it's about management, about how they manage, abusive bosses or whatever, that's interesting to anybody who's had an abusive boss or might have had one. And so you just write it in a way that will engage this audience, of the broad general audience. Try to see if it's timely, show us that you're an expert in what you're talking about, and, you show us the research. And, as I was saying, she said this, but usually our articles are 800 to 1,000 words. So you want to have focus. You want to get to the point. You want to be able to convey, you know, like going back to the one last.
Brian, I'm really, really sorry, but I don't want to go over
Okay.
time.
No problem.
I enjoy listening to you, but at the same time, I also want to make sure that we respect the time of our participants. I'm very sorry. Garima, would you like to end the event, please?
Yeah, I apologize to Brian that you felt rushed in the end, and hopefully we can follow up, or the links would help. So I just want to thank everyone for their engagement today, and just our speakers, Maya, Brian, just thank you for sharing your insights. Our next event will be in January. We are doing an event in collaboration with Ivy Sustainability Salon. So it's going to be a research salon on research on impact creation. So we invite your best papers, your best research ideas. Do consider submitting to the salon, and Sylvia will share more details when she shares the other materials from today. We have an amazing group which is growing in terms of volunteers. You see three of them: Katrine, Marlin, Suwin here. We have Haita, who manages our Twitter account. If any of you are interested in volunteering, you're more than welcome. Something we're going to do from now to January is write impact journeys of early career scholars and publish them on our website. So our team of volunteers have already started putting together these stories. If you are interested in being featured, please write to Katrine and she can start that conversation with you. As always, send us your questions and feedback to this email. We have a website, and I hope you follow us on Twitter so we can continue this conversation in the Twitterverse. Thank you again, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all for attending. Thanks to our speakers for your time. As Tom said, there's a lot of demands on time and attention, so thank you for giving us some of yours. We are going to end the event now, so I'm going to stop recording.